Okay, so, wow, you guys sent us a ton of stuff on Trump's global impact. I mean, articles, analyses, reports, you name it. Looks like you really want to know how the world changed during his presidency. So
Yeah.
buckle up, because that's exactly what we're going to dive into today.
Yeah, it's a big question. There's no denying that Trump's presidency was a major turning point in global politics. Not just shaking things up, you know?
Yeah.
He really changed the game in a lot of ways.
Okay, so where do we even begin with all this? I think the thing that jumps out from all this material is China, right? And that trade war that Trump launched,
Oh.
Slapping tariffs on what, like billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods?
Yeah, those tariffs were definitely attention grabbing. But to really understand what was going on, we need to go deeper than that. It was about challenging China's economic practices, pushing back on what the U.S. saw as unfair competition and, intellectual property theft. Actually, the trade deficit went up more than 50% while Trump was in office.
Really? Wow. So maybe the tariffs didn't work as well as he planned. What
Yeah.
happened because of that?
Well, it's complicated. On the one hand, the tariffs messed up global supply chains and hurt some industries here in the U.S., but they also forced companies to rethink things, like to diversify their production and rely less on China. So in a way, it sped up this whole trend of deglobalization that was already happening.
So it wasn't just about the economics then?
Absolutely. It was about strategic competition with China, for global influence. And this played out most clearly in the Indo-Pacific region. You've probably heard of the Quad, the partnership between the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia. Well, that became a much bigger deal under Trump. They did joint military exercises, expanded intelligence sharing, and even started working on infrastructure projects to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Huh. Interesting. So you're saying Trump might have actually made the U.S. stronger in that region by pushing those countries closer together?
Yeah, it's a possibility. The Quad is still pretty new,
Yeah.
but it could become a serious counter to China's growing influence in the region. And other countries are watching too, like Vietnam and Indonesia. They're feeling the pressure from China in the South China Sea and looking for ways to push back.
Okay, so China's one piece of this puzzle.
Yeah.
But what about the rest of Asia? What happened there with Trump's policies?
Let's look at South Asia first, because that's where some of the biggest changes happened. Afghanistan was a big focus for Trump, remember? He wanted to end the forever war, and he ended up negotiating that deal with the Taliban, which was very controversial.
Oh, yeah. And that withdrawal was pretty chaotic, to say the least. Was it a success or a failure? I mean, what do you think?
It's hard to say. There are strong arguments on both sides. Some people say it was necessary to get the U.S. out of a war that was costing too much and that we couldn't win. Others say it abandoned the Afghan people and will just create more instability in the region.
It's tough for sure. What about Pakistan? Trump had a real roller coaster relationship with them.
He did. At first, he cut military aid because he was worried about Pakistan supporting terrorist groups. But then he tried to reset things and even praised Pakistan for helping with those Afghan peace talks.
Sounds like he was trying to play both sides.
That's one way to look at it. It was part of his transactional approach to foreign policy, always looking for an advantage and ready to change his mind if he thought it would help the U.S.
Gotcha. So what about India? How did that relationship change with Trump?
Actually, the U.S.-India relationship got a lot stronger under Trump. He saw India as a key partner to counter China's influence in the region, and he wanted India to be more involved in Afghanistan.
So basically, the U.S. wants India to balance out Pakistan and China in that region.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And that makes the geopolitics of South Asia really complicated, with all these competing interests and alliances shifting all the time.
So we've got China, South Asia. What about the rest of Asia? What were some of the key things happening there?
Well, in East and Southeast Asia, Trump's trade policies definitely ruffled some feathers. But his administration was also tough on China's actions in the South China Sea. And that actually made countries like Vietnam and Indonesia more assertive, standing up for themselves a bit more.
So maybe Trump accidentally made the U.S. stronger there, too, by pushing back against China.
It's possible.
Yeah.
And it ties into what we were saying about the Quad. Some people are talking about expanding it to include other countries like South Korea and Vietnam.
Wow. So the Quad could become even bigger and more powerful in the region?
Yeah, it's possible. And that would definitely change the balance of power in Asia.
Speaking of balancing acts, let's talk about Australia. They're in a tricky spot, right?
Yeah.
They rely on China for trade, but they're also a key ally of the U.S. How did Trump's policies affect them?
Australia was in a tough position under Trump. They were benefiting from China's economic growth, but also shared the U.S.'s concerns about China getting more assertive. And Trump's policies on trade and climate change especially made things really difficult for them.
So how did they deal with that? Did they side more with the U.S. or China?
They tried to walk a fine line. They stayed close to the U.S. on security, but kept doing business with China. They were very careful not to upset Beijing too much.
That sounds hard.
It was. And it's only going to get tougher as the competition between the U.S. and China heats up.
All right, let's move on to Europe. Trump's relationship with Europe was, well, let's just say it was complicated. He wasn't shy about criticizing NATO and pushed hard for Europe to spend more on defense. He even threatened to pull the U.S. out of the alliance.
And it wasn't just NATO. They disagreed on trade, climate change, the Iran nuclear deal, all sorts of things.
Sounds like he really shook things up over there.
He did. Definitely created a lot of tension. But there were also some unexpected outcomes.
Like what?
Well, for one, it pushed Europe to become more independent. Strategically, European leaders realized they couldn't count on the U.S. as much as they used to, and that they needed to be able to defend themselves and make their own foreign policy decisions.
So maybe Trump accidentally made Europe stronger, too, by forcing them to stand on their own 2 feet.
Maybe. It's something to keep an eye on for sure.
Okay, time to talk about the Middle East. Another place where Trump had a huge impact. His decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal was probably his biggest foreign policy move.
It was definitely controversial. It really changed the balance of power in the region and had consequences all over the world. Iran started ramping up its nuclear program again, and tensions in the region got a lot worse.
But then he also managed to get the Abraham Accords going.
Right.
Normalizing relations between Israel and some Arab states. That was a pretty big deal diplomatically.
It was. And it's interesting because those two things, withdrawing from the Iran deal and getting the Abraham Accords signed, are actually connected.
How so?
Well, by ditching the Iran deal and putting sanctions on Iran, Trump basically pushed Iran and its rivals in the region closer together. That created an opening for the Abraham Accords, which were partly driven by shared concerns about Iran.
So these moves that seemed to contradict each other were actually part of a bigger plan.
You could see it that way. Whether it was a good plan or not is a different question.
True. So what does all this mean for the Middle East in the long run?
It's still too early to know for sure, but things are definitely changing in the region. The old order is breaking down and a new one is emerging. It's a time of a lot of uncertainty, but also a lot of opportunity.
Okay, shift gears to Russia. Trump said he wanted to improve relations with Putin when he came into office, but things didn't go exactly as planned.
No, they didn't. Their relationship actually got much worse during his time in office. A lot of factors contributed to that. Russia meddling in the 2016 election, the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, that ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
And that breakdown in communication had some serious consequences for things like arms control and strategic stability, stuff that affects everyone.
Exactly. The lack of trust and communication between the U.S. and Russia is a big problem. It makes mistakes and escalation more likely and makes it much harder to tackle shared challenges like climate change and nuclear weapons.
So what's next for the U.S. and Russia? Is there any chance of things getting better?
Hard to be optimistic right now. Things are really tense and there are no easy solutions. But both sides need to find a way to manage their differences and stop things from getting even worse.
I agree. Moving on to Central Asia. Trump didn't really have a consistent policy for this region. He mostly reacted to events and didn't engage much, and that gave China a chance to really increase its influence there.
And that's worrying. For the U.S., Central Asia is strategically important. It has a lot of resources, and it's right in the middle of several major powers: Russia, China, India.
The U.S. tried to use concerns about how China treats the Uyghurs to counter Beijing's influence, but it didn't really work.
Right. What's happening in Central Asia is like a miniature version of the bigger competition between the U.S. and China. It's a region where the U.S. is struggling to keep up with China's growing power.
So what does that tell us about competing with China in a place that's becoming more and more important to global politics?
It tells us that the U.S. needs to be more active and strategic in Central Asia. It needs to offer a real alternative to China's way of doing things, and it needs to be willing to defend its values even when it's tough.
Okay, let's talk about Africa. Trump's Africa policy was kind of a mix of things staying the same and being ignored. Some people were worried that his administration would reduce the U.S. military presence in Africa, which could create opportunities for extremists and help China gain even more influence.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. Africa is facing some serious challenges. Terrorism, poverty, climate change. The U.S. can't afford to ignore the continent.
What would happen if the U.S. disengages from Africa? What does it mean for security development and Africa's place in the world?
It could lead to some bad outcomes. It might embolden extremist groups, weaken democracies, and hurt economic development. And it could make it easier for China to become even more powerful in Africa. They already have a lot of influence there.
Okay, one last region to cover. The Americas Trump's focus on immigration led to big changes in U.S. policy toward Latin America. He cut aid and made those controversial deals with Mexico.
And his protectionist trade policies had an impact too, like renegotiating NAFTA and putting tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum.
So how did all that affect U.S. relations in the region? Did it work the way he wanted it to?
It's a mixed bag. On the one hand, Trump's tough stance on immigration did reduce the number of migrants coming from Central America. But on the other hand, it hurt U.S. relations with Mexico and other Latin American countries and caused serious humanitarian problems.
So there are pros and cons, and people are still debating them.
Exactly. And it's important to think about the long-term effects of those policies, too.
Okay, last big theme for this section. Multilateralism, Trump's America First agenda, meant the U.S. pulled back a lot from global cooperation. He backed out of international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal. He made it hard for the World Trade Organization to function and cut funding to international organizations.
And that really affected global governance. It created a leadership vacuum that other countries, especially China, are happy to fill.
So what does this mean for the future of multilateralism? Can it recover after Trump?
That's the big question. It's clear that multilateralism is struggling. But it's also clear that the world needs countries to work together to solve global problems like climate change pandemics and nuclear weapons.
So the question is, can the U.S. be convinced to get back involved in the global system, or will they keep going it alone?
That's what the Biden administration is trying to figure out right now. And their decision will have a huge impact on the future of global order.
Okay, we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We've looked at how Trump's policies affected every part of the world, from China to the Middle East to Europe and beyond. And we've explored the complicated things that shaped his foreign policy.
We've seen how his actions reflected and sped up trends that were already happening in global politics. And we started to think about the long-term consequences of his presidency for the world. All right, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about the economic side of things. You know, we hear a lot about Trump-tonomics, but what does that actually mean, like on the global stage?
Well, from what I'm seeing in all this material, it's a really interesting mix. You know, traditional economic policies and then some pretty disruptive moves. On one hand, he was all about keeping interest rates low to help the economy grow.
Right, and he also really pushed for those tax cuts. Remember, he argued they would encourage investment and create jobs. And those are pretty standard economic tools. You know, presidents from both parties have used them.
Yeah, but then you have those trade wars he started.
Yeah.
Especially one with China. It really shook up the whole global economic system.
And that's where things get really interesting. The sources point out that even though he was focused on shrinking the trade deficit, it actually got bigger during his presidency.
Yeah, by a lot, too. Maybe he didn't realize how interconnected the global economy really is.
Yeah, it's possible. He definitely thought he could use America's economic power, you know, to force other countries to do what he wanted. But it's also worth remembering that his approach really appealed to some people. People who felt like globalization had left them behind.
That's a good point. It wasn't just about economics. It was a shift in how people thought about things. A rejection of globalism, you could say.
Exactly. And that shift had ripple effects all over the world. Other countries hit back with their own tariffs, supply chains got messed up, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the markets.
So even if some of his tactics were questionable, he definitely shook things up.
No, definitely. And economists are still debating the long-term impact of Trump-domics. Did his policies actually help the U.S. economy? Or did they just speed up deglobalization and economic nationalism?
I guess we'll have to see how history judges that. But I think it's safe to say that Trump's presidency left a mark on the global economy.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Okay, shifting gears again, let's talk about technology. This is another area where Trump made some big moves, especially when it comes to what they call geotechnology.
Yeah. You can't talk about Trump's global impact without talking about technology.
Right, yeah.
Especially that whole battle over 5G networks.
That was a major issue during his presidency. He saw 5G as crucial for national security, and he went all out to try and stop Huawei, that Chinese tech giant, from building 5G infrastructure around the world.
From what I understand, he saw Huawei as a direct threat to U.S. security and economic power.
Exactly. He said that Huawei's close ties to the Chinese government made it a serious risk for espionage and cyber attacks. And he also saw Huawei as a symbol of China's ambitions to be the top dog in global tech.
It's interesting how this went beyond just technology. It became a sort of proxy war for the bigger rivalry between the U.S. and China.
Absolutely. And it forced other countries to pick a side. You couldn't really stay neutral on 5G anymore. They had to decide if they were with the U.S. or with China.
Must have been tough for countries that depend on both the U.S. and China for trade and investment.
It was. And it created a lot of tension and uncertainty in the tech world, but it also showed just how important technology is to geopolitics now.
So in a way, Trump's actions made the tech landscape more fragmented and competitive.
Exactly. And that has had consequences for everything from global supply chains to the development of AI.
Okay, so we've talked about economics, we've talked about technology, and we've seen how these are all tangled up with geopolitics and that U.S.-China rivalry. But how does this affect everyday people? How will these changes on the global level change their lives?
Well, I think one of the most obvious impacts is economic uncertainty, right? The trade wars and the tech war messed up global supply chains, and that makes things more expensive for consumers, and there are fewer jobs in some sectors.
And that uncertainty can make people feel insecure and anxious, worried about the economy and their job.
Exactly. It's like a feeling that things are out of control. And we're seeing that in countries all over the world. It's leading to more populism and nationalism as people look for easy answers to complicated problems.
That's a good point. And it makes it harder to find common ground and agree on things like climate change, immigration, global health.
Yeah, so it's not just about the economic effects. It's also about a loss of trust in institutions and the breakdown of social cohesion.
So what can we do about it? Is there a way to deal with this new world order without feeling helpless?
Well, I think the first thing is to be aware, stay informed about what's going on and understand how these global trends affect us.
Right, we can't just ignore what's happening. We have to be engaged citizens, and that starts with knowing what's going on.
Exactly. And it also means being critical thinkers. We need to be able to separate fact from fiction and think about different viewpoints on these complex issues.
And we need to be willing to question our own assumptions and biases.
All right.
We all have them. It's important to be aware of how they influence how we see the world.
Another important thing is to find ways to connect with people who have different opinions than our own. It's easy to get stuck in echo chambers online and offline, but it's so important to talk to people who see things differently than we do. Respectfully, of course.
Yeah, because that's how we start to understand each other and find things we agree on, even if we don't agree on everything. We can still learn from each other and find ways to work together.
Exactly. And finally, I think we need to remember that we can all do something to shape the future. It's easy to feel powerless when you think about these huge global forces, but we all have agency. We can all make a difference.
Yeah, it might sound corny, but it's true. Whether it's voting, volunteering, donating to the site, causes you believe in, or even just talking to your friends and family about these issues, every little bit helps.
And I think it's especially important for young people to get involved. The world is changing fast, and it's going to be up to them to figure out this new landscape and make a better future for themselves and for everyone who comes after them.
That's so true. The future isn't set in stone.
Yeah.
It's up to us to shape it. And that's a hopeful thought, I think.
I agree. It's a call to action. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to be engaged citizens and to work together to create a world that's more just fair and sustainable.
So, as we finish up this part of our deep dive on the global impact of Trump's presidency, I want to leave you with this. The world is complicated and it's changing faster than ever. But that doesn't mean we're powerless. We can all do something to shape the future. And the more informed, engaged, connected we are, the better we'll be able to deal with these challenges and build a world we can all be proud of.
Well said. I think that sums it up perfectly.
All right, so we've spent the last two parts really digging into Trump's global impact. Trade wars, shifting alliances, this new era of great power competition. It's a lot.
Yeah, and we've seen how those changes are playing out in different parts of the world. And in areas like economics and tech, really impacting things.
Exactly. So now it's time to bring it all home.
Yeah.
What does this mean for you listening right now? Why should you care about all of this? And what can you even do about it?
That's the question, isn't it? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this information. Like global events are somehow separate from our everyday lives.
Totally.
Yeah.
But the truth is, these big changes are already having a big impact on how we live, work, and interact with the world. Like it's all connected.
Yeah, one thing is that economic uncertainty we talked about. Remember, the trade wars, the tech war, they messed up supply chains, which means higher prices for us and less jobs in some areas.
And I think it's also making people feel more anxious and divided.
Yeah.
The world's getting more connected and complicated, and it's easy to feel like things are out of control.
That's a great point. And we're seeing that in countries all over the place. It's leading to more populism and nationalism, people looking for easy answers to really complex problems.
And that makes it harder to agree on things like climate change, immigration, global health.
Yeah.
Big issues that need cooperation.
Exactly. So it's not just about the economics. It's about losing trust in institutions and the fabric of society kind of fraying.
So what can we do? Is there any way to deal with this new world order, without feeling totally swept away by the current?
Well, I think the first step is just to be aware, you know? Stay informed about what's happening and understand how it affects us. Like, connect the dots.
Right. We can't just ignore it. We have to be engaged citizens, and that starts with being informed.
Absolutely. And being critical thinkers, too, you know? Being able to tell what's real and what's fake, and to look at different sides of these complicated issues.
And to question our own assumptions and biases. We all have them.
Right.
It's important to realize how they affect how we see the world.
Yeah, that's huge. Another important thing is to talk to people who have different opinions than us. It's easy to get stuck in our own little bubbles, you know, online and in real life. But we have to talk to people who see things differently. And do it respectfully, of course.
Yeah, I agree, because that's how we find common ground. Even if we don't agree on everything, we can still learn from each other and figure out how to work together.
Exactly. And last but not least, I think it's important to remember that we can all make a difference. It's easy to feel powerless with all these big global forces, but we all have the power to do something, you know?
Yeah, it might sound cheesy, but it's true. Whether it's voting, volunteering, donating to causes you care about, or even just talking to your friends and family about this stuff, it all adds up.
And I think it's really important for young people to get involved. The world's changing fast, and it's going to be up to them to figure this all out and make a better future.
Absolutely. The future isn't set in stone. We get to shape it.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty hopeful thought.
I think so. It's a call to action, you know, a reminder that we all have a responsibility to be engaged citizens and work together to make the world better, more fair, more sustainable.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Trump's global impact, I want to leave you with this. The world is a complicated place, and it's changing faster than ever. But we're not helpless. We can all do something to shape the future. And the more informed, engaged, and connected we are, the better we'll be able to handle these challenges and create a world we're all proud of.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world transformed by Donald Trump. I hope you found it informative and got you thinking. And keep exploring these issues. Read more. Do your own research. Talk to people who see things differently. You'll keep the conversation going.
The world needs more informed and engaged citizens like you guys.
And on that note, we'll say goodbye for now. But keep thinking, keep learning, and keep engaging with the world around you.
Thanks for listening.